Our keynote panel this morning on the subject of resisting economic nationalism, a plea for free and open markets. And we have two extremely distinguished businessmen. First of all, Samuel DiPiazza. Whenever I see the name, I almost say Samuel DiPizza, but I'm sure. And it's a great pleasure to have you here, sir. Mr. DiPiazza spent his career after graduating in Alabama and Houston with Pricewaterhouse, has managed various offices and regions, and is at present the chief executive of Pricewaterhouse, based in New York. In addition to that, in 1998, he was named America's leader for tax and legal services. He serves as a trustee of the International Accounting Standards Committee Foundation, chairman of the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. He's an executive committee member of the International Business Council of the World Economic Forum, executive committee member of the World Trade Center. He's received many awards for his public service. It's great to have you, and we're looking forward to what you have to say to us. And then on his right is Joseph Hogan, an American from Geneva College and Robert Morris University, where he was educated. And really he spent 23 years of his career with General Electric, particularly, I think, with General Electric Plastics. Going from one position to another, and then becoming Chief Executive Officer and President of GE Fanuc Automation North America, then becoming the COO and acting CEO and President of GE Healthcare. And then after 23 years with the company, last year he left, and he is now the Chief Executive Officer of ABB. It's great to have both of you with us. I'm going to ask them to speak one after the other, and then we're going to have a Q&A. Mr. DiPiazza. Please give him
Thank you, Lord Griffith. As our speaker was talking about his devotion to soy sauce, I was texting my 82-year-old Italian mother, asking her what recipes does she have for soy sauce and Italian food. I'll let you know so that we can translate it right back to the Italian world. It really is a great pleasure to be here back in St. Gallen. It's in my view, one of the great opportunities for dialogue every year. I'm amazed by the great work done by the students here. It's a unique symposium, and one that I really do treasure having the chance to participate in. As Lord Griffin said, Joe and I will make a few comments, a few points, but mostly we'd like to get into a discussion of this economic environment we're in and how it is leading us down a path potentially that could be very difficult for our markets. Because I also believe that open and free markets have an enormous benefit to society. And I suspect if we took a vote in this room, 95% of you would say yes. There's free markets, open markets, globalization creates the opportunity for the best use of assets. It allows for specialization, efficiency, productivity, all the things that we all understand. But beyond that, it has opened the doors for hundreds of millions of people to move out of poverty and have opportunities to begin to live a life that many of us have long been accustomed to. But we have to admit, as we head into this conversation, that we are in very, very difficult times, and that our economies around the world are under enormous strain. It's probably the first time in 25 years that we'll see world trade actually shrink. Now, put that in perspective. Since 1990, the average trade around the world has been increasing annually at about 6%. And this year, we see trade reducing somewhere between 3%, I've heard as high as 9%. So the swing of trade is dramatic. And maybe no more dramatic than if you look at the emerging markets where there was close to $1 trillion of capital moving into the emerging markets just 2 years ago. And this year it's probably 1/8 that number. So what we have in a global financial crisis has quickly moved to a global trade crisis, one that's occurring because demand has fallen off. Not necessarily because of bad actions, but there's simply an enormous fall off in demand across the world. But industries, whether it's Australia or Chile or my home country of America or here in Switzerland, are asking for assistance from their governments trying to survive an incredibly difficult environment. And that brings us to the questions of economic nationalism. And before you talk about why we should resist it, you must understand why it is logical to have economic nationalism. If you're going to argue against it, you better understand, frankly, that the arguments for nationalism, protectionism, are not entirely illogical. And they're not entirely against instinct. Unfortunately, the result is just not good. We operate in a world with local governments, national governments. It may be a globalized world, but our constituencies, just like this canton here in Switzerland, are local. Job losses, economic pressures are happening on the ground. If you're the person who lost their job, this economic crisis is all about your hometown, your company, your job. And when taxpayers have to bail out, whether it's automobile companies or banks or whatever it might be, and deficits are created that are going to be paid by our children and our children's children, it's not unusual for the policymaker to say, if we're going to spend the money, we want the benefit at home. And if you don't understand that, you cannot make the arguments against nationalism and against protectionism for free trade. And if we look around the world, this is happening everywhere. Whether it's in my own home country of the United States, where a huge stimulus package, President Obama, enormously popular both in our country and around the world. But as he stood before the U.S. people just a week or so ago and implored them to buy U.S. automobiles, Chryslers, because the government was going to own a big piece of Chrysler, and buy a U.S. automobile before they buy a Toyota that happens to be produced in the U.S., or a car produced by Daimler, which happens to be produced in the U.S. The White House has a list on its website. You can access it. 24 key issues that they're focused on, from urban policy to civil rights to health care. Trade is not even in the top 24. So when you look at whether it's a country like the U.S. or the Swiss encouraging local lending to local businesses, or the French saying we're going to stimulate the automobile business but you can't close French factories, or Gordon Brown saying British jobs for British people, we've got a problem. And this is an emerging problem that is gaining steam. Now, the G20 said in just their meeting just weeks ago that they were all for acting together to avoid any protectionism acts. They met in November and said that. They met again just a month or so ago. In the meantime, 17 of those 20 countries have implemented what is easily described as protectionist actions. Almost 50 different actions around their own space. So when you have to listen to people like the mayor of Lansing, Michigan, in the Rust Belt of the U.S., when he says, You want Americans to start spending, but they can't start spending if they lose their jobs and transport those jobs to other parts of the world. And it's translating itself into political pressures in Greece, in Russia, in the U.S., in Britain, and other places. Buy American can be transferred just to buy French, buy British, buy Japanese. So the root of the dilemma is, how do you convince policymakers that their actions, as subtle as they may be, create a domino effect that can take us to a very bad place? Again, I'll use my own country as an example. When President Obama implemented a policy restricting the transport of Mexican goods through Mexican trucks in order to protect union truckers in the United States, Mexico retaliated with a tariff against fruit. And $50 to $60 million of trade was lost in a matter of weeks. All within WTO rules. All within WTO rules. So you ended up losing significantly. Let's take that up a level. What if you find the U.S. deciding to close its auto markets to Japan, to Europe? $80 billion of trade is lost. In retaliation, Japan, Europe, China closed their markets for airplanes, chemicals to the U.S. $100 billion of businesses lost. So we really have to find a way to convince the markets that subtle, small changes are huge as they begin to multiply. And when I speak of these subtle changes, whether it's tariffs like Mexico, where it was a within WTO guideline adjustment, or licensing restrictions, which is what the U.S. did against Mexico to restrict trucks, or anti-dumping actions, which every country is now applying to every other country, or whether it's aid to national industries. Chancellor Merkel is very upset with the U.S. because she feels that the U.S. is distorting trade with their support for U.S. industries. All of this, within very subtle moves, are adding to our problem. And the biggest issue ends up falling on the least capable parts of the world to deal with. And that's the emerging markets, and particularly the poorer countries. What we've seen over the last 8 months, 10 months, is a dramatic fall in commodity prices, a dramatic fall in the movement of capital, and as our prior speaker talked about, a change in labor practices, frankly affecting migrant workers more than any others, that are hurting the poorest countries of the world. So we find ourselves in a place where all of this economic nationalism can take us to a recession much, much deeper than we're working through right now. There are good parts that are occurring. The moves with the IMF to begin to fund at a much more substantial level, the trade financing that has been committed, $250 billion of trade financing, because trade financing has been a problem in this cycle. But the words around Doha and other support have so far just been words. And so we are seeing an imbalance occur in terms of actions versus these words. So let's be clear. This recession is not the result of protectionism at this point. But if this recession leads us to a higher level of protectionism, it would be a disaster. We're a long way from the 30s. In the 1930s, world trade dropped 25% in a matter of just a year or two. We're talking about a drop this year of 3 to 5 to 7%. We're a long way from those places. But it doesn't take very much with global supply chains, with all the connectiveness, for our economies to become very, very weak. And business has to take a lead here. It's easy for business to declare, we need help, we need a response. So-and-so's country still is being subsidized, we need you to do the same, or we need to fight back, we need tariffs, we need protection. But in the end, free markets support all of us, And if we don't find a way to resist the easy answers, this recession will become much, much more difficult. I look forward to the dialogue. Thank you.
Good morning. It's great to be here today. I wanted to follow up on Sam's comment when he was asking his 84-year-old grandmother for soy sauce recommendations. Understanding how well Kikkoman is doing, I sent a note immediately to our M&A person to see if we could add a soy sauce line to ABB, because it could be a good growth area for us. So I'll have to check it out when we get back. Look, I think I'll follow up on some of Sam's comments. But first of all, I think from a free trade standpoint, we all have to be grounded in the sense of the history and the quantification, in the sense of why it is so important and why, just like a law of physics, free trade is beneficial across nations, across cities, across individuals. And I think if you go back 200 years ago to David Ricardo, who wrote extensively about the laws of comparative advantage. And basically, the simplistic side of comparative advantage is that countries and individuals should do what they do well, what they do best. And that trade should be facilitated between those organizations or those people to make sure that occurs. And over the last 100 years, an enormous amount of wealth that's been created by having open borders has absolutely been incredible. And I think we can all see that piece and how important it is in our lives overall. You know, growing up in the United States, as Sam has also, and you see what happens from a distortion standpoint when free trade or tariffs are enacted. And I'll give you one thing that is kind of under the surface, but is so fundamental to an inefficiency in the United States that it's almost unbelievable, is we raise sugarcane in the United States in both Hawaii and the southern part of Florida. And from a law of comparative advantage standpoint, that sugarcane is not that productive. But we have huge lobbying efforts in the United States and tariff rates of anywhere between 15 and 25% to keep sugarcane from coming into the country. So anytime you go to the U.S., pick up a soft drink and turn the label over and read it. And it'll say high fructose corn syrup on the outside of it. It's because of the artificially high price of sugar coming into the U.S., there's been a huge corn syrup development in the United States that's been a subsidy for farmers in the U.S. for years. Companies like Wrigley Spearmint Gum and soda companies have moved outside into Canada to move away from these trade barriers. Jobs have been lost, lives have been disrupted to do that. Now, even more so today, there's a huge corn ethanol business in the United States. It's huge. Iowa corn farmers have been incredibly enriched by it, because they have another opening for their crop, and the prices for corn have been astronomical over the last couple of years. And again, sugarcane ethanol, and ethanol based on sugarcane, which is done very efficiently in Brazil, is 10 times more efficient than corn-based ethanol. But we started a whole industry in the U.S. where we should be feeding the corn to cows and let that sugar in. So it's not just bad, it's distorting, and it distorts people's lives. You know, there's I don't know if you follow it, since 1995, the Heritage Foundation has printed a book called The Index of Economic Freedom. And I've followed that very closely. And if you watch that, they statistically list a number of variables as far as the openness of an economy goes. And if you take the top 4 economies in the world that have grown the most over the last 5 or 6 years, they happen to be Switzerland, the U.S., Singapore, and Hong Kong. And they have the highest index of economic freedom. And you could guess what the lowest ones are. North Korea, Cuba, Zimbabwe are completely down on the bottom of the list. And if over the last 5 years, if your index of freedom have increased 5 points, your GDP has increased 4.5 points. If it's decreased 5 points, your GDP is only increased 1.7. So almost a loss of 3 points. And if you study business, you know 1 point of GDP on a whole gross domestic product is a huge number. So there's a lot of statistics and a lot of things out there that can show you every day that free trade is so important for the world. But again, you know, Bill Clinton said one time, and I think he's absolutely right, that all politics is local. And what Sam referenced today is that mayor in Michigan, that's local. And protectionism makes sense for that mayor, given this point in time. And we see so many people laid off in that region. And it's so hard to overcome that. And I think that's the confluence of events that we have today that we really have to address. My favorite economist of all times is Joseph Schumpeter, who grew up and practiced close to here in Vienna, Austria. And I think you all know, if you study business, is the whole idea of creative destruction. And he was so right. And I think we all know that. Whether ABB, if we come up with a new amorphous core transformer, it'll completely change the way transformers are made in some way. Jobs will be lost in one part of the economy. They'll grow in another part of the economy. But we can never forget that the disruption that has to society. I grew up in a town real close to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And if you've ever known that piece, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania is a steel city. And I had a town across my bridge where I lived. It was called Aliquippa, Pennsylvania. And they had 15,000 jobs in a steel mill called J&L Steel in 1975. I still remember it vividly. 15,000 jobs, 3 shifts a week. In 1976, that mill closed down. And 15,000 people lost their jobs. And the dislocation was massive. I had friends and families that had to move hundreds and thousands of miles away to find jobs to support their families. You can't stand in the way of that, but you have to be empathetic in how it affects people's lives. And so what should governments do? Government should have policies, as Moki-san indicated, that helps with those dislocated people, that in some way helps to re-educate them so they can come back into the marketplace. If they have to sell their homes and they lose money, it should be tax deductible. It's not in the United States. You only are taxed when you make money. You can't take a deduction when you lose it on a house. You have to make sure that Social Security and benefits like medical benefits and those kinds of things are transportable so people can move in some way. So there's very positive things that we can argue against, but we can't argue against the massive destruction it can create in society and people's lives. So with that, I'll be happy to sit down and to take any questions you might have. Thank you.
Could we have the lights up again, please? Can I thank you both very much for your speeches? A great plea for free trade. Ricardo follows Diderot. This is becoming a very intellectual morning. But also your sympathy to local politics. I see that, I hear it all the time in the House of Lords in debates. I'd like to just start with one question to you. It's the following. How significant do you think is the huge bailout of banks in putting a negative case for the market and making it more difficult to argue the case which we all wish to argue?
Well, clearly it is a major factor because of the numbers involved.
Yeah.
If we can only go back 2-3 years, if we would have ever thought about governments putting hundreds of billions, in fact trillions in the U.S. case, into the system, whether it was banks or anything else, we would have just said impossible. And the fact that the complexity of the situation and the combination of the lack of understanding of what really happened in these banks, the resentment to the wealth that was created while the party was going on, and the concern of what it will take to pay off these deficits or the ultimate impact in inflation and everything else makes the taxpayer not just unhappy, almost violent. And in fact, in some countries, violent. And so then you turn right around and say, oh, and by the way, we're going to lose 10,000 jobs here because this business is no longer competitive or can't survive. We're not going to support this industry, but we will pay the Wall Street bankers. Absolutely. Now, we've done a really lousy job as business of trying to explain what really happened here, and I think it's made the political situation much, much more complex.
John.
I would agree completely with Sam on this. I think at another level too is that the ordinary individual in the world doesn't distinguish between a banker and a business person, and so all business gets lumped into one situation, and so it makes it even more difficult to explain. And I've been completely on board with some of the bank bailouts that have had to have occurred, but it makes the argument of then why don't you support Chrysler or why don't you support another industrial business? It's hard to make that intellectual argument to someone that's only going to listen to you for about 3 seconds. And I think it makes it much more difficult for us.
It's very interesting. That would be exactly my perspective as well. It's tough. Who'd like to put questions to the panel? Gentleman there, and then a gentleman further back, and then a lady here, and then a gentleman there. Thank you. I hope I can still see you when...
My name is Anton, and I'm from University of Lausanne. My question is the following. As both speakers have pointed out, free trade, free market is beneficial to economy as a whole. However, individual companies may, in short term, benefit from protectionist measures. So it creates a prisoner dilemma of sorts. So my question is, how can we make sure that everyone in the corporate world is working towards the same goal, moving in the same direction, maybe an incentive system of sorts? Could you please reflect on this? Thank you.
Joseph, do you want to start on that one?
That's a really good question. I think all businesses, and we're paid to grow earnings for our shareholders and to grow jobs for our employees. And at times, I think that when you into a situation like that and you think that you could promote trade barriers in some way to help your business, you see that all the time. If you're not multinational and you don't have the second order effect of having that occur in another marketplace that could hurt your business in some way. I just think there are conferences, there are coalitions and all that help to bring businesses together of any size to help to promote free trade or fairness from a tax standpoint across a lot of different countries and a lot of different industries, and I'd say that's probably where the strength comes from. But I think we'll never ever eliminate just individual companies trying to exploit a situation to help themselves temporarily.
Yeah, I agree with that, Joe. I also think that businesses have a responsibility to be engaged in the dialogue with the policymakers. Let's be fair. We might understand business. I understand the world of finance and the world of accounting and the world of transparency. Joe has a long history in the industrial world. Policymakers are politicians. They need some help and advice here. And when business sits on the sideline, too embarrassed to actually engage in a constructive dialogue with policymakers, we're going to get what we're going to get. We're going to get political answers. I think the other thing that business has to do is understand, and Joe is exactly right, if you're in the aircraft business making aircraft components, you want to do what it takes for your shareholders, employees, and stakeholders. And if there's another company in another part of the world that has an unfair advantage, say cheaper labor, then you're going to want to fight back. So what we really need is we need institutions, global institutions that work, like the WTO that works. We need institutions that create balance in these cross-border environments, and we need governments that work together with common or at least compatible regulation. And if business can help promote that in good times, then when you get into bad times, those systems begin to work. And frankly, you're going to always try to take up for your own environment when you're struggling. But you've got to realize that the institutions need to be there and they need to be robust.
Thank you. Gentleman towards the back.
My name is Niels Roth, originally from the Netherlands, but I study here in St. Gallen. My question is going in the same direction as Anton's. Is it a good thing that tariff and trade negotiations are a political thing? or should the WTO be changed and become more an industry negotiation? Because from a rational perspective, it's likely that tariffs will be reduced much quicker. So could you both comment on that?
Well, I mean, I think maybe in an idealistic view you would say, oh, business could do this better. But let's be fair. These are public policy issues. These are much bigger than any one company. And I think we have to have governments that are deeply involved and, frankly, leading the discussion. I think now, the governance structure of the WTO, how they achieve agreements, the difficulty in any multilateral environment. But I think business needs to have a voice and needs to be visible, needs to be constructive. But ultimately, these are big policy questions. It was Lord Griffin's mentioned. I serve as a trustee of the International Accounting Standards Board, the oversight body of the IASB. It is a non-governmental structure that creates standards that impact businesses and countries all over the world. And our biggest problem is that governments say we're not accountable. We're business. And so we have to find ways to be accountable to policymakers, and we've worked hard to do that. So I think businesses play a role here, but I don't think businesses could negotiate this to the ground.
I'd give you probably the same perspective and an example, too. I would say that industry couldn't do it. It wouldn't be responsible enough. And the example I'd have is when I was in factory automation, there's individual protocols that different kinds of program logic controllers use to communicate with each other on factory floors. Europe has a standard, Japan has a standard, the U.S. has 3 or 4, and we put an industry association together for 5 years to negotiate the protocol exchange. No one ever agreed. Because just like countries, everyone wanted to exploit their individual position in their specific geography. So I think in this case, I'd use the Churchill comment is governments are the least worst option in this sense, and you just hope that you can guide them and support them in some way.
But if you take the climate change discussions that are going on, and we all agree that this is as enormous an issue as we have on our landscape, we all also agree that governments have to decide how we are going to, in a collaborative way, deal with CO2 emissions. But if business doesn't come to the table with a very consistent framework, we've got a problem. But you can't expect a coal-producing power utility to reach the same answer as a utility-producing power utility. A government has to say what's in the long-term interest of our people.
Thank you. Lady there. Could we get a microphone to the lady? Thank you very much.
I'm Usha, originally from India, now living and working here in Switzerland at the ABB headquarters in Oerlikon. So, my question is, one of the effects of globalization is the placement of managers internationally. And GE and ABB are both reputed engineering giants. How does, Mr. Hogan, your experience of the corporate and cultural differences between the US, UK, and Switzerland influence the decision-making process or strategic approach of a big company? Do you see these as major factors?
Joseph.
Sam, can you answer that? I'll just...
No, Joe, you're on your own on this one.
Look, it's a very good question because, whether it's ABB or it's GE, you're right. There's a certain amount of, I would say, national heritage that would go into decisions about people and leadership as you drive a large global national company. Specifically on ABB, I can tell you the wonderful thing about it is it's so multinational. So just in Oerlikon alone, you know that we have 60 different nations that are represented inside that building of 300 people. And so what you end up with is an amalgamation of people that have lived in a number of different countries like myself during their career and have somewhat, what I would say, a global perspective rather than a domestic perspective that we grew up in. I'll tell you what I've learned over time, though, that's so important is that, and ABB's embedded this way, too, and so you look at our Chinese business or our Indian business, which is a very strong business for us, is you want to, as much as possible, you want to be in that country with national resources that understand that country, that understand the markets, that have us respond to it as much as possible. you only want to use foreign nationals at times when you have to. And so I call it in-country, for-country. And what I try to do as much as possible is find leaders that understand that economy, are based in it, and can move. Because it's so important that you're responsive to, and you understand the politics and the demand cycles. And it's so hard to do that if you're on the outside, and that's your first. So I can't say that it never plays a role in it, but at ABB at least you have a leadership team that's much more multinational and sensitive in the sense of the cultural norms that have to be respected in different countries.
Just as an observation to that question, PwC is in 150 countries and with deep roots in each of those countries. But there's no question that a globalized marketplace and a globalized PricewaterhouseCoopers creates enormous opportunity for learning, sharing, and growing in the local markets. I'll give you just a couple of examples. We have 5,000 people in Africa with our organization, Africans, that have a chance to actually become professionals as a result of a globalized marketplace. That wouldn't happen if there wasn't a globalized marketplace. Probably one of the largest employers across Africa outside the energy businesses. We have 11,000 people in China that are Chinese, multilingual, and have opportunities to work all over the world. We have women running our organizations in places like Bahrain and Turkey, Muslim countries, and we take that lesson to our countries like Canada and the UK and say, if it can work in Bahrain, why can't it work in your country? And so we learn from each other. And so globalized marketplaces are enormous opportunities for growth within these kinds of companies. And we'd lose it if the borders went up.
Two great answers there. Gentleman here, and then a lady there, and a lady behind.
My name is Guptara, and my question relates to complementary currencies. The background is as follows. Switzerland was mentioned by Mr. Hogan as one of the countries that is the most open economies in the world. And yet the fact of the matter is that Switzerland's economy continues to do well through cycles that go up as well as cycles that go down in a very steady way. Rensselaer University study, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute study, indicates that one of the reasons why Switzerland continues to do well across the economic cycles is the existence of a complementary currency called the WIR, W-I-R. 30% of Swiss companies belong to this counter-cyclical currency. But the gentleman who was bringing me up from the railway station yesterday at the start of the conference had never heard of the WIR. We were passing the WIR Bank office on the way here. He had never noticed it. Nothing about the WIR is ever taught at St. Gallen, I believe. I would be astonished if it is taught in most business schools or universities. And yet, if the university, Rensselaer American University study is right, it is one of the secrets of Switzerland's success. My question to Sam DiPiazza is there a particular reason why this secret is so little known? Is it being considered in other parts of the world? What are the pros and cons of complementary currencies like this?
Joe, you want to handle this one? We didn't teach this at the University of Alabama either. You know, I'm not an expert at it, but I will say this. You know, many of these very important balancing opportunities, they don't really need to be understood broadly. They need to be understood by the parts of the economy that make use of them. And although I don't understand exactly how that system works, I must say to you that it is what we need to look at is how can other countries implement, follow, learn from that cycle. I can't really comment beyond that because I'm not that familiar with it. Joe, do you have?
You know, I would say, look, I'm a monetarist. I believe from a monetary standpoint that, Milton Friedman proved that, years ago in the sense of, how much currency is in circulation, inflation rates, growth rates, and those kinds of things. And I think a properly managed currency is a good thing for a country regardless what it's called. But I would say I would not look at monetarism as being the explanation for Switzerland's success. I think Switzerland is very well balanced economically between financial services, smaller industrial companies, agrarian parts of it that make a lot of sense, that are international in scope in a sense of what it sells. And that balance really helps it through different economic cycles, because you don't take a huge hit one way or another depending on how things are moving. And I would just say monetary stability is great, but I also think a good portfolio in the sense of your gross domestic product that's well spread and diversified is maybe more of a variable in that equation than just the currency.
It will be very interesting when this cycle is completed, hopefully sooner than later, to understand how those countries that work their way through this with better systems, what were the advantages and disadvantages. I mean, some people in India would say the Indian economy is much better because its banking system is so closed. Well, that's counterintuitive to me. But it is certainly clear that some systems, like the U.S., where there was so much pride in its robust regulatory environment, wasn't working. And how did we let the leverage get so far out of place? And so I think there's an awful lot that we're going to learn when the cycle is over about what did create the volatility and what created stability in places that worked.
One other comment as Sam talks that I think about, I obviously travel all over the world and observe companies and countries, and from a banking system standpoint, my empirical outlook here has been that the less well a country spoke English, the better off their banking system is.
Can I just add one thing? I used to be a professor of monetary economics, and I know a little about competing currencies. I know nothing whatsoever about the where, is it? But I have to congratulate our two panelists who clearly knew nothing about the where either. But they produced outstanding comments. So well done, my friends. Yourself, a lady here, and then a lady behind.
Hello, I am Yoshi Aoi from Japan, and I would like to have a question on protectionism and the role of civil society, which is consisted of innocent citizens whose basic daily life depends on free and fair market economy at a macro point of view. And I think if those citizens can share a future vision at a global level, they can be the best balance of society against protectionism and also against the reckless driving of financial system. And so let me ask two questions. What do you think is the role of citizens and the civil society at the era of globalization? And what do we need to help the citizens to become active decision makers? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Yeah. Civil society and globalization. Joseph, do you want to start with that?
That's a really difficult question, but I would say the simple answer from my end is that economic literacy is so important, and it's so seldom seen. I can tell you in the school systems that I grew up in, middle-class America or UK where I've lived, or Belgium or Holland and those areas, is some of the concepts that you take for granted, that you've studied, that you understand well, are not understood at all from a normal person. So I think trying to make economics as simple for people as possible so that they can look beyond maybe the localness that we mentioned before is, in some way, has to help.
I served 3 years as the chairman of the worldwide chairman of an organization called Junior Achievement Young Enterprise. And for those of you that know anything about that organization, it had its roots in the U.S., but now it's in over 100 countries. And every year, JA educates close to 9 million young people on entrepreneurship, free enterprise, how the markets work, and starting at age 7 or 8 of just what does money represent. And I think Joe's exactly right. It is very difficult to describe the benefit of globalization to civil society or a representative of civil society if they don't understand how these systems work. I also, and so JA is part of that. I think we all need to look at how we can help our communities move up the curve of financial literacy. I also think that those of us that lead businesses, PricewaterhouseCoopers would be a fraction of what it is if it weren't for globalized markets. Cisco probably wouldn't exist. ABB would be a medium-sized industrial. ABB is remarkable because of the way it was founded and the way it grew over the years in a multinational way and a global way. We need to help. Our people need to be advocates of globalization. And we have to, as leaders, we have to help them understand why it is so important for them. And, when you look at the top, the Financial Times 100 companies, there's millions and millions and millions of people around the world that work for these companies that ought to be singing the praises. Instead, they're sitting on the sideline being quiet. That's our fault.
Thank you. Lady whose hand is up.
Thank you. My name is Tatiana. I come from Ukraine. Yesterday, the whole day, and today, the whole day, we have been listening to very passionate speeches about preserving the tempos of globalization and opening the markets. But I have a little comment. I'm a little bit surprised that none of the speakers before have mentioned a fact that there is actually 1 billion of people who live under the border of poverty, as mentioned in the book by Sir Collier. So my question would be, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the concept of food sovereignty. African countries, the same as small island developing countries, they were forced to draw back their tariffs, their import tariffs for food by WTO and to the great extent by the United States. And for example, a country like Haiti had to draw their tariffs import tariffs for rice in the mid-90s. So out of the net exporter of rice, Haiti became a net importer of rice. And with the growing prices for corn and more use of ethanol, which contributed to the food crisis, there is a huge humanitarian catastrophe now in this country, the same as in a lot of other African and Southeastern Asian countries. Could you please comment maybe how could we elaborate the question of food sovereignty, or let's say food sovereignty versus free trade? Thank you.
Yeah. Sam, do you want to...
I think your point is outstanding. Well, let's first start with the fact that we need to recognize that the globalization, the free trade, the opportunity for growth and participation in open markets has taken, as I said in my comments, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. But it has still left more than 1 billion at less than $2, $3 a day. And unfortunately, the last 18 months has probably added 50 or 100 or 150 million to that list because capital has stopped flowing into emerging markets, aid has been reduced, and many of those markets are no longer exporting at the levels they were. The Doha round was started in 2001 to try to bring some sense to this. And it is, I think, extraordinarily disappointing that the developed world, and Joe commented to the issues of sugar and corn and in my home country, but as we sit here in Switzerland or look across the border into France or south into Italy, or we go to Japan and think about these major developed countries restricting their borders around issues of food, it's crazy. And the Doha round has bounced and bounced, and there is no deadline set to solve this. The G20 says we're committed, and then they do nothing. And frankly, it is very, very disappointing where we sit. And I think some people have said in this economic crisis we shouldn't be worried about a trade round and trying to push through this answer. Doha was all about the developing world. It was all about creating a more level playing field and opportunity. It was not about protecting the developed markets. And so I think we've got to get our heads back into it. And if business doesn't play a more active role, but in many respects I think business has frankly begun to give up on that subject because they've watched policymakers just intransigent in making moves. So you're right. I don't have an easy answer, and we're losing the battle right now in the developing world and around poverty.
Joseph?
Yeah, it's interesting you'd be from the Ukraine and ask that question, because if my memory served me correctly, before the revolution, the Ukraine was the breadbasket of Europe, in the sense it supplied an unbelievable. It was just so wealthy in that sense, and how it, and it's. I don't think it's quite recovered to that point. Even after the changes. Honestly, from my personal standpoint, I think one of the worst things that developed economies do is subsidize farming in their areas. And because subsistence economies, one of the only things that they can often reach for is an agrarian opportunity in some way. I had a program in Ghana, Africa, when I ran GE Healthcare, where we used to help several hospitals there with having clean water and infrastructure and things in place. And so I walked around Ghana. What always had grabbed me is what opportunity that country had from an agricultural standpoint, but it was never developed, because there's so much subsidized food that comes in from developed countries into there that helps to suppress that piece. And so I think we have to do a much better job from a business standpoint, individual standpoint, of pushing on our governments to not subsidize agriculture in the home marketplace, because the second order effect of that in these other countries is really devastating. And then the last thing I'd tell you too is that you take the Haiti example and the rice example, is that's true. And from a business standpoint, what I would hope too is that we would help the Haiti people to understand, how do you move up the food chain? How do you turn that crop into value added in some way? How do you package it in a different way? Just don't export it in the raw sense. If you produce cocoa in some way, how do you produce chocolate, or how do you refine the cocoa before you export it? So they can begin to set not just an agrarian foundation, but a business foundation on top of that too. And I think that's where we can help overall from a business standpoint, to help that thought process, not just reduce barriers, but help people become business people, more self-sufficient in that sense.
And gentleman here.
Thank you. Tim Overmans from Germany. I've got a question relating to environmental boundaries. Nowadays, I think we all agree that environment is a real problem and that climate change is going to happen and is going to happen to all of us. But every time you hear people talking about changes to the politics, you hear, we can't have a CO2 tax because when we do it in our country, we are going to lose against other countries who don't do it. So you could say free market is a barrier to this quite effective way of CO2 taxing, in the short term at least. So how would you suggest reconciling this element of short-term economic competitiveness and environmental change? Thank you.
It's a great question. And what I'd say is, you can tell from my comments, I'm a totally free market person. I've grown up that way. But there's one aspect that the free market has failed in, is it doesn't cost the environment properly. It never has. And so when some environmental aspect is destroyed in some way, a river's polluted in some incredible way, and fish are killed and different things, that was never in the economic calculations of that company if it wasn't regulated in some way. Society in some way had to bear the brunt of that. And I feel, again, this is where governments can intervene and help in a huge way, is if we agree on the science of climate change and what's going on today, then CO2-based energy is going to be, and carbon-based energy is actually more expensive than what we're giving it credit for because of the effect it has on the economy. So it should be taxed. And then we have to have some agreement, and hopefully the Copenhagen Summit, and now with new leadership in the United States with the Obama administration, it's finally sensitive and awake to this thing. Hopefully we'll get some agreement. But honestly, this is where governments have to enter into the equations, because we do a discounted cash flow analysis at ABB on something. There's not an environmental component in there. If it's CO2-based, and there should be, given what we're seeing today. And that's something where the market isn't efficient in that sense, and governments need to help.
Yeah, free markets, Joe's exactly right. I mean, it's about putting a price on carbon. And how you put a price on carbon, whether it's through a carbon tax or through cap and trade with actual allowances that cost something as opposed to being given away. And the only people that can do that are governments. But please, free markets is not about markets with no restrictions or no regulation. I think we get confused at times. We say free markets, laissez-faire, let us do as we please. That's not what we're saying. We're saying regulation where regulation makes sense. But let's don't regulate to closure. And in the area of carbon, and it's not just carbon, it's water, it's ecosystems, it's a lot of places, there is a price to the usage, and we need to figure out a way to get that price built into the product. And then, frankly, there's nothing better than a free market to drive the objective, because you're not going to dictate this with policy. You're going to have the market make the choice. When carbon is priced, the market will begin to look for alternatives.
Yeah. One gentleman here.
That's a good point. It's not a free-for-all.
Hi, I'm Max. I'm from New Zealand. A lot of countries have turned very quickly to Keynesian stimulus packages without much debate about the protectionist implications of those stimulus packages. And so my question is twofold. First, do you think those stimulus packages can work in rejuvenating demand? And secondly, can you think of any alternatives, apart from those Keynesian stimulus packages, that might succeed without such protectionist implications?
Well, there is no question that your observation about the move to Keynesianism is the state of where we sit. And as much as I detest large deficits, government intervention, government ownership of enterprises, when you had a world where the demand side collapsed, which is what we faced in the last 12 months, demand stopped. The only entities in the world that had the resources to recreate that demand were governments. And that's effectively what's happened. The governments have stepped in through stimulus, through other mechanisms to try to put a spark back into the economy. And I think, although we can all be critical about this program or that program, I agree with what Joe said earlier. If I'd have had a better idea, I would have said it a long time ago. I think governments had to become very aggressive and active. Now, it connects to a couple of the prior questions. The key is that governments do this in some type of a collaborative and common approach. If one government is very aggressive in its stimulus and another government sits on the sideline, then you get these incredible imbalances that happen and restrictions on borders. But, I think unfortunately, we got ourselves into this mess through too much leverage and too many imbalances, and the governments were probably the only place we could go to try to create some solution.
Joseph.
I'll give you two examples of an effective stimulus package and an ineffective one. So the U.S. just passed a $700 billion stimulus package. And from what I can see, only about $20 billion of that will be infrastructure targeted. And I would say maybe $30 to $40 billion in total that stimulus package will hit in 2009. The rest are pretty much government subsidies that are given out that I wouldn't call Keynesian at all. I think when a country invests in infrastructure, it always gets a return on it. As I go around Switzerland, I marvel at the infrastructure here. whether it's the electrical trains or, I mean, you drill holes through hills, I can't believe it, okay? And how they come out the other end and you know where you are is another piece. But it's amazing, and Switzerland has benefited from that so much because all society can take advantage of that infrastructure piece. But when a pig farmer gets a $100 million subsidy to study pig manure, which was in the recent, that's not Keynesian. Now, I have yet to see in our business anything in the United States that's affected by the stimulus package. Now, China, on the other hand, dedicated $180 billion to upgrade their grid, and their grid, which is the electrical grid in China. Within 90 days, we saw our business respond to that, and how efficient that government targeted an infrastructure piece, began to get money behind it and make it work. So I actually think Keynesian theory is just a food for the gods for politicians and democracies at times, because it can make them spend money where they'd like to spend money in a way that's irresponsible. By the time the U.S. package really hits, it'll hit mainly in 2010 and 2011. It'll be inflationary. It won't be, the economy will be coming back by then. And so I like Keynesian programs that are infrastructure focused. I think they work, and I think in the long term it's an investment for a country. But when you just start subsidizing programs for special interest groups, that's not Keynesian, that's inflationary. And I'm sure the U.S. is going to feel that by 2011 for sure.
Very good. It's almost time to bring this session to a close. I'd like to ask one question to the panel, if I may. Particularly to Sam. Sam, when you spoke, you said, but also Joseph, you made a great argument for free markets, for free trade, against protectionism, against nationalism. And then what you said was, or what I heard you say was, at present, there are too many politicians around the world saying buy local. So President Obama says buy Chrysler, Gordon Brown says British jobs for British people, and so on. And the second thing is that we are beginning to see governments subsidizing various industries. We have it in Britain, you have it in America. In the longer term, you could say, the real answer to all of this is education. You know, if we had, in our state schools, if we had people really well educated, and if we had really good retraining programs. When I was advising Mr. Thatcher, unemployment was rising, we'd say, let's do everything we can, crash programs to help people who are made redundant get back to work. But frankly, that is still, in my judgment, a medium-term outlook. As I hear more politicians beginning to say buy local, I feel that we're drifting very uneasily into protectionism because politics is local. Clinton was right. Is there anything that can be done, either through the G20 or through a business initiative, to actually prevent this really developing into something which could be, you know, very nasty and could transform this bad recession into a real depression?
Well, I think you've captured the whole, our entire challenge. How do we avoid this creeping protectionism that happens in small steps, and then we wake up one day and find ourselves with borders we can't get past? And the role of business. I'm not one of those who believes that business is just there to create shareholder profit. I'm one of those that believes that business over time has to be responsive to multiple stakeholders and make a profit. And I think business has to play a very important role with policymakers resisting the temptation of simply responding to local jobs. And that's the way we run our own businesses, and it's the way we advise our own governments. And so and as Joe described so well, it's by pushing back wasteful stimulus toward things like technology and toward things like education that we know are going to make our societies better. So the business organizations in the world, whether it's the roundtables, the business roundtables, whether it's the ICC, whether it's the World Business Council, whether it's individual companies, as we work with our governments, we've got to have our voice heard. And when we see the populism turning to protectionism, if we don't stand up, we're going to get the conclusion 3, 4, 5 years from now with a world that that finds itself in a tailspin.
I don't want to overlap with Sam, but I just say we, as business people, we have to find time. We're always so busy, and the last thing you want to do is go see a politician. And the fact is, and it can be one of the most arduous things you go through. But the fact is, they'll listen to us. And when you do have that audience, it's important. And I think, especially during these times, we know what happened the last depression. Sure, you've all read about the Smoot-Hawley tariff bill that a year later trade was down 40% or 4.5%. Now it's debated a lot of ways. Did that cause it or not? But we have such a role to play, I think, in combating that because all the data is there. And so we have to be the countervailing force, I feel, in business.
And there's some symbolic things. If we let Doha fail, and let's be honest, it is not just failing, it's probably at its last breath. Yeah. If we let that fail, all we've said to the world is we don't have solutions, maybe we don't care. And Doha is not going to pull us out of this recession. But it is very symbolic. And the questions around food and the questions around developing world, business has to be a leader here, not sitting back just in a survival mode. And some businesses are doing it more need to.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've had 2 CEOs of 2 key global companies, and I think I'm right in saying they've had an enormous breadth in their response. They've also shown a tremendous conviction that the market is a remarkably powerful device for creating prosperity and alleviating poverty. And they've done it also with a sense of humor. And even when they didn't know about a subject, they were brilliant. So